with 925 Adam. Halldale, Rosecrans.
911, what's your emergency?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of my series, Crafts and Crimes. Every week I post a new video of myself crafting while talking about a different true crime. This week I will be talking about the Robison family massacre, also referred to as the Hart murders. The Robisons were an upper-middle-class family from Lathrop, Michigan in the metropolitan area of Detroit. They were all found massacred on June 25, 1968, while at their vacation home on Lake Michigan at the Blisswood Resort in Hart. Their cabin was located in the dense, secluded North Woods and was nearly impossible to see from the road. The Robison family consisted of Richard, a 42-year-old advertising executive who owned a magazine called Impresario. Shirley, a 40-year-old homemaker who looked after the children and the family home. Their children were 19-year-old Richie, who was a student at Eastern Michigan University. 16-year-old Gary was a student at Southfield Lathrop High School. 12-year-old Randy, and 7-year-old Susan. There are several things that are known for sure about the day the Robison family was murdered. On that morning, Richard had a meeting with his banker and was made aware of a large sum of money missing from his accounts. He then called his office and demanded to speak to Joseph Scolaro, the man he left in charge of his businesses while on vacation, but he couldn't account for the missing money. Later that same day, Richard visited Chauncey Bliss to pay his respects after the death of his son in a motorcycle accident. Bliss was the caretaker of the Robisons' cabin and had also built it and all the other cabins in the Blisswood complex in 1956. During that visit, Richard mentioned that the family were going to see a property in Florida and one in Kentucky. At the end of the day on June 25, Russell Figg, the gardener for the Blisswood complex of cottages, was paid by Richard for some work, making him the last person to see Robison alive. After the discovery of the bodies, Russell Figg contacted the police to say something was bothering him about the final time he saw Richard Robison. He said that he saw the eldest sons Richie and Gary but not Shirley, Randy or Susan. Reportedly, he felt uneasy and worried, but it is unclear what exactly was causing his concerns. We know for sure the family was attacked in the evening on June 25, but some people question whether or not the events were building throughout the day. This was one of the many leads that was never investigated in the case. On June 26, Russell Figg and his assistant arrived at the family's cabin to finish the work he was unable to complete the previous day. Most people were aware that the Robison family were going to Florida, so Figg thought nothing of seeing both cars in the driveway. Both gardeners were alarmed to see what looked like bullet holes in one of the rear windows, but they were covered over with cardboard. There was also a note left taped to the cabin wall that said, quote, "We'll be back July 10th. After receiving complaints from a neighboring cabin about a horrific smell coming from the Robisons' place on July 22, Chauncey Bliss went to check on the family. The door was locked, but being the caretaker, he had a key. He expected to find that the smell was being caused by an animal who had died underneath the cabin, but it was far worse. Bliss came across the first body in the living room covered by a blanket. He immediately backed out of the cabin and contacted the authorities. He later recounted to the police that when he approached the house that the curtains were drawn and that the side door was padlocked shut. The investigation began immediately on the 22nd of July, 1968, 27 days after the family was murdered. The family were found in different rooms. 1 in the living room, 2 in a bedroom, and 3 in the hallway. It was believed that the crime began with 5 gunshots aimed at Richard Robison through the back window. Shirley Robison was found face down in the living room with a single gunshot wound to her head. She was covered over with a checked blanket except for her legs from the knees down. Richard Robison was found in the hallway. He had gunshot wounds to his head and chest. An autopsy determined that he had blunt force trauma to his head, likely caused by a claw hammer found at the scene. Richie was found partially in a bedroom with his legs sticking out into the hallway with multiple gunshots to his head. Randy was found laying on top of his father in the hallway. It was determined his cause of death was a gunshot wound, but no bullet was ever recovered. He was covered over with a lavender rug from his shoulders down to his buttocks. Susan was found in the hallway near her father and brother. She had been shot in the face, and the bullet casing was found on her clothes. It was also determined during an autopsy that she had the same blunt force trauma as Richard, likely caused by the same claw hammer. Shirley's body was posed intentionally to make investigators believe the crime was sexual in nature. Bloody footprints around the cabin led to the conclusion that the crime was committed by a single perpetrator. The initial autopsies were performed at the Emmett County Fairgrounds because the smell and advanced state of decomposition made it impractical for the bodies to be brought to the morgue. The length of time between the crime coupled with the summer heat resulted in advanced decomposition, which made it difficult for the medical examiner to determine the full extent of the family's injuries. The Robison family's bodies were exhumed on November 16 and further autopsies were performed. Police began their investigation by speaking to witnesses in the area about what they may have seen and heard near the family's cabin at the end of June. They spoke to Russell Figg and his assistant about what they saw on the 25th and 26th of June. Officers talked to neighbors who remembered hearing raised voices and rapid gunshots on the night of the Robison family murder, but they chalked it up to someone shooting seagulls on the beach. It was difficult to determine the motivation for the murders, as everyone the authorities spoke with said the family had no enemies. The children were described as being polite, well-mannered, and they did very well in school. No one seemed to have any idea who would want to murder the Robison family in such a gruesome manner. Investigators began digging into Richard Robison's business dealings for answers about why the family was murdered. They discovered that although he was presenting himself as a prosperous executive, his companies were in trouble. Robison was allegedly engaging in funny business with the finances for impresario, all the while telling his family and colleagues he had various deals in the works. They discovered that Richard had left his business in the hands of 30-year-old Joseph Scolaro, an employee who had embezzled nearly $60,000 or about $515,810 today. Joseph Scolaro was an Army veteran who spent a year at Harvard before beginning work for Richard Robison's advertising and publishing companies in 1965. On the day of the murder, investigators discovered that there had been multiple phone calls back and forth between Robison and Scolaro. It is suspected that they were in relation to the missing funds. After leaving the office on June 25 at 10:30, Scolaro couldn't account for his whereabouts between then and 11 p.m. He had no solid alibi for the 12-hour window. Scolaro claimed to have been at a plumbing convention when the Robison family was murdered, but no one remembered seeing him there. He complied with police and took 3 polygraph tests, 2 he failed and 1 came back inconclusive. The police connected Joseph to the murder weapons used on the Robison family: a .25 caliber Beretta pistol and a .22 caliber AR-7 Armalite semi-automatic rifle. He had bought 2 of each firearm. He claimed to have given away one of the pistols to Richard Robison and both rifles before June 25, 1968, but a neighbor told police he remembered seeing the rifle in Scolaro's house before the murders. He was also known to have bought some rare .25 caliber Finnish ammunition that was only sold for a brief time in Michigan between January and February 1968. Joseph Scolaro was documented as having bought these same bullets on the 2nd of February, 1968. These Seiko bullets were found inside the cabin where the Robison family was massacred. Investigators were able to determine that the bloody shoe prints found at the scene matched Joseph Scolaro's boots perfectly. He was known to buy his boots 2 pairs at a time, and it was believed he wore the other pair while committing the crime. He was one of the few people who would have been able to locate the remote cabin as he had been there before. When the evidence was brought to the county prosecutor in December 1969, more than a year after the murders, he declined to bring charges against Joseph Scolaro as all the evidence against him was circumstantial. There was not one piece of evidence that conclusively pointed to him being the murderer. The case went cold after that. For years later, after a new prosecutor was elected, the Robison case was reopened. He agreed to press charges against Scolaro. Before the arrest warrant could be issued, word reached Joseph that he was going to be arrested, and he took his own life on March 8, 1973. He left behind a suicide note that said, quote, "I am a liar, a cheat, and a phony, but I am not a killer." Michigan state law does not permit an open murder case to be officially closed if a suspect commits suicide. While investigators do strongly believe that the person who committed the crime is in fact deceased, there are others who believe the theory of Joseph Scolaro as the killer doesn't completely add up. One of the biggest issues that people have is the timing. Scolaro's ex-wife said that he arrived home by 11 p.m., but neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Freeman, claimed they heard gunshots at the Robison family cabin at 9 p.m. The drive from Blisswood to Detroit was 275 miles. In order for Scolaro to have made it back by 11 p.m., he would have had to be driving 138 miles per hour. However, when the Freeman statements were further investigated, they stated that they heard a woman's voice followed by a man's, and they were both excited, leading her to think it had to do with target practice. The evidence pointed to Shirley as having been killed second, so it couldn't have been her voice, and the shoe prints in the cabin suggested only one killer. Another potential witness, Dale Haven, said that he heard a gunshot come from the cabin at around 6:30 p.m. This was brushed off by investigators because Mr. Haven allegedly heard the sound from 4 miles away in Harbor Springs. If this is true, that would definitely have created a different timeline that allowed for Joseph Scolaro to be the murderer, because it was within the 12-hour window he went missing that day. Unfortunately, the police didn't test to see if it was possible to hear gunshots from that distance. No one can say for sure whether or not this would have helped build a stronger case against Joseph, but it does seem likely it could have. There are a few other possible suspects looked at since the death of the Robison family. Some people suspect that it could have been caretaker Chauncey Bliss, an eccentric man who was suspected by some good Hart locals. He was the one who discovered the bodies, and he built the cabin, so he knew the layout. The theory goes that he killed the Robison family because he was grief-stricken after the death of his son, and he was angry with Richard's reaction to his son's death. For many who have studied this case, that theory doesn't add up. Richard Robison visited Chauncey Bliss to offer his condolences and brought $20 worth of flowers. It's not believed that he was even a suspect with the police. The other name that has come up as a suspect is John Norman Collins, a man believed to be responsible for a series of murders between 1967 and 1969 in southeast Michigan. Collins attended Eastern Michigan University the same time as Richie Robison, and they knew each other. This case, however, didn't fit his usual MO, and there was no known reason why he would have attacked the Robison family. Most people have discounted Collins as a viable suspect in the case. It has been over 50 years since the massacre of the Robison family. The case remains open and classified as inactive. To this day, investigators believe there is no mystery about who committed the crime and that it was prime suspect Joseph Scolaro. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Crafts and Crimes. If you're interested in the things I'm crafting, please check out the links in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and comment below with what future cases you want me to talk about. Don't forget to subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss out on any future uploads. I'll see you all next time.